Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the second in our weekly archaeology and preservation webinar series that we're going to be doing until at least June. We'll see how things go. I'm Erica Duvik. I'm your moderator for today. So before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, please check out our website for the full list of upcoming webinars. I'll put the link in the chat window so you guys can click on it. Secondly, if you have any questions for our panelists during the presentation today, please use the Q&A box. There should be an icon for that at the bottom of your screen. Just let me know if you are having trouble finding that. And then, of course, I'll be here to help with any technical issues you run into. Just please use the chat box to let me know if you have any technical questions. Okay, so today we have Todd McMahon from History Colorado's Office of the State Archaeologist. He serves as the State Curation Coordinator and manages the program he is going to be talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Todd.
Oh, would help if I unmuted myself. Thanks very much for participating in today's webinar, and I hope that you find this valuable. So I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation, and I'll have a few announcements here. Let's see. Let's get that going. So before we begin, I just would like you to know that on your webinar, you'll notice that there's a few options. One is a Q&A, and as well as a chat function. And I always kind of like to begin these kind of sessions just kind of introducing yourself. So if you wouldn't mind on the chat function, just putting your name and to tell us what institution you might be with, or if you're with a local government, what local government you are associated with. And feel free, if you'd like to communicate with each other through the chat function, that would be great. I'm going to run through the entire presentation. And so if you've got a question and you want to jot it down in the Q&A section at the time, that's fine. Or if you want to just wait until the end, I'll try to answer that. We should have about 15 minutes or so toward the end to answer those questions. And to keep you kind of on your toes, I will have two instant polls to kind of have you participate in if you'd like. To see kind of what your understanding is of things and where your knowledge is of the program. So with that, I will go ahead and begin. Okay, so it really does belong in museums. Many of us are probably familiar with that famous Hollywood cliche from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. In this case, what I'm really going to be talking about is state artifacts and fossils, and that they should be curated at a museum or repository. To kind of begin, what is archaeology? For those of you who are joining us and are unfamiliar with all this, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what archaeology is, but just to kind of make it simple, of course, archaeology is the scientific study of past human culture and behavior through material remains, through those artifacts. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of the definitions that archaeologists generally use as we go along. There is always some misconceptions about archaeology, and oftentimes when we're talking to the public and both children and adults, we always get confused about what archaeology is and how many dinosaurs we've excavated. And of course, we have a lot of similarities and disciplines between paleontologists and archaeologists, but we do different things. However, in Colorado, because of the Colorado legislators, we do, in fact, oversee the permitting of paleontological work on state and any subdivision of state lands. And we're also kind of charged with making sure that the fossil collections that are collected are also properly curated. So My presentation is going to be really focused heavily on the archaeology, but just to let you know that this is a focus that we also deal with as well. So where does all of this begin? It really kind of begins through legislation and the Historical, Prehistorical, and Archaeological Resource Act of 1973, in which the Colorado legislators gave title to the state of Colorado to all archaeological, and you'll notice natural history specimens or fossils also found on state land, as well as any subdivision of state land. So state, county, city, town, local public district, if you will. So I like to just sort of talk about it as non-federal public lands. So this is where it all comes from. This is a definition kind of really what we're talking about as state property, all the artifacts that are removed from those lands. And then the other piece that is sort of really a guiding piece that we do with this program is our rules and procedures, which is the 8 CCR 1504-7, section 9, which talks about our curation of collections in approved museums. Those are the guiding principles. We have this on our website, so we'll kind of go over that a little bit further along towards the end of the presentation. So where do these artifacts come from? Of course, in our day and age, we oftentimes do a lot of archaeological and paleontological survey without collection, and that's not so that we are, not overtaxing our repositories, but there is certainly the instances when we are collecting, particularly for diagnostic artifacts, and also situations that we're faced with archaeology and the excavation, either intentionally or sometimes through mitigation efforts. And those artifacts need to be curated or collected and put in a proper repository according to our laws and procedures. Some basic definitions that I will sort of briefly go over here with you. There's ancillary samples. Those can be kind of thought of as the charcoal samples, the botanical remains. Sometimes those are also things that are usually sometimes the subjects of destructive analysis. It's sometimes these things are not at all curated and usually are collected for research purposes. When we really are concerned about destructive analysis and also the artifacts themselves is, the artifacts. And a good definition is just an artifact is a portable object made and used by humans in the past. Under our rules and procedures, we define curation as permanent maintenance, storage, preservation, documentation, and ability to retrieve stored, collected materials from our historical, prehistorical, and paleontological specimens and records. And a diagnostic artifact is an artifact that possesses a characteristic of a specific time period and our culture. And of course, a fossil is here used to discuss non-human fossilized living specimens. Think paleontology in this regard. All right, it's also really important to kind of mention the fact that our founding federal legislation in historic preservation, the National Historic Preservation Act, defines historic preservation as including, in addition to things such as recordation, documentation, but also curation. Curation is a part of historic preservation. And it's also important to point out that the National Historic Preservation Act, or the NHPA as we often refer to it, also defines historic property or historic resources to include, for eligible and listed National Register sites, the artifacts and records and the material remains related to such property. So if those collections are collected in a real sense, they are a part of the site and should be considered. So they certainly add to our understanding and the eligibility of the resource. So it's also important to recognize that through local governments, and this comes from our Historic Preservation Fund manual, the HPF manual, and through the National Historic Preservation Act, that review boards, commissions, and particularly if they want to be certified, have to have a certain ratio of professionals on them. And one of the disciplines that is allowed is to have someone from curation background. So I know a lot of historic preservation commissions and boards have a diverse group of historians and archaeologists, but sometimes we don't have a lot of curators, but this is something that you might want to consider for your board. Okay, so artifact curation. Unfortunately, it's often considered sort of that thing that isn't really considered a lot of. We do, very few of us actually give it due consideration, and even within the discipline of, say, even archaeology. But it really is so important, and really archaeological research is not complete until you do the curation step. And it's really important so that we know that we're collecting things, for the future. We're collecting it for future generations of researchers and scholars. So it really shouldn't be considered just the end of the story. Colorado is actually fairly unique. We are kind of in that minority, less than 30% of states that actually don't have a centralized repository that operates as such. Many of our neighboring states have a centralized repository, but we have kind of this dispersed network arrangement. So a bit unique in that regard. Here's some examples of some of the repositories that are centralized. Many of those types of facilities are associated with academic institutions. Some are standalone institutions. History Colorado serves as a centralized repository in when there is no local alternatives. There's no local approved repositories. Some background history about curation in Colorado. We had a crisis, and maybe perhaps in some ways we still have a crisis, but I think we're mitigating it quite a bit. It really kind of started in around 1999 or the 2000s. And this all started because we had in the past a sort of unwritten understanding that a lot of the collections would be going to the University of Colorado at Boulder. And suffice it to say, I would say that the University of Colorado at Boulder became overwhelmed with the collections. They ran out of storage. And this caused really a kind of panic within the archaeological community here in Colorado. It made front page news, both in the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post at the time. It also sort of that concern bled over into to the national scene for the Society for American Archaeology and other places. And even our own professional group, the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists, got heavily involved in trying to address this issue. And they came up with a standing committee to try to address that. That report is still currently available on the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists website. And so at the same time, this was also something that was going on nationally with even federal collections as well. Department of Interior had their Inspector General look at some collections, some of which predated the National Historic Preservation Act, where a lot of collections were housed in non-federal repositories. This is something that they recognized and have tried to now address. So we're not unique in having kind of this situation, and it's all been something that many agencies have been trying to address. In 2003, the History Colorado, or the Colorado Historical Society as it was then known, received a State Historical Fund grant to partner with the Forest Service to look at the feasibility of creating a centralized state repository. This was an effort that really kind of shone light onto the real costs, which were extraordinarily high at the time. And unfortunately, because of the high costs, and there was really no political will to do this, it didn't happen. So, but we've learned a lot from that effort. As I mentioned, other states were also trying to address this issue. We're fortunate to be able to kind of capitalize on some of the efforts in other states, like in Texas, where they also have a dispersed network of repositories, much like Colorado. And they address this issue through some rules and procedures, which we were able to kind of capitalize on some of their efforts and borrow some of their legal frameworks from as well. So how do these repositories actually hold state collections? We had to have a legal framework for us actually to kind of work. And we, as I said, borrowed some of this terminology from the state of Texas, but all the collections are held in trust. So all of our state collections and our approved repositories are like trustees. They are, in a sense, holding state collections for the benefit of the state of Colorado and for its citizens. They hold it as if they really owned it themselves. So they're caretakers in a sense. So we kind of help to deputize those repositories. This sort of trust agreement, which is kind of like a bailment agreement, if you will, allows these repositories to hold on to these and again, treat them as if they're their own. And it also kind of, I think, really does help to empower local communities with their collections. When we changed the rules and procedures back in April of 2017, we also had some defined approved uses for our repositories. Those repositories are allowed to fully exhibit and charge reasonable admission fees for exhibitory purposes. The collections may be studied and photographed. Paleontological resources can be cleaned according to natural history best practices. The collections may be loaned to other institutions. They just have to send notice to our office that they're being loaned. Approved museums may charge competitive deposit fees for collections. This helps to kind of help offset some of the costs and the burdens that our state approved repositories are receiving. Approved museums may charge curation and administrative processing fees for curation agreements for permittees. So those also are allowances, again, to help sort of offset some of the costs and burdens for our repositories. So currently we have the result of a dispersed network, but a very robust network of about 37 accepting and approved repositories. This includes full museums as well as on-site repositories, those that are kind of more like visitor centers that have collections, things of that nature. And this really kind of, I want to emphasize that this is for all state subdivisions of state land. And so if you're working in a local jurisdiction or a local community, it's really important to know who your repository is, because if you have archaeological collections, if there isn't an approved repository, chances are that your collections are not going to be remaining in your community. They may have to come to Colorado, to Denver or elsewhere. So here is where we're going to give a quick snap instant poll for you. And the question is, do you know if you have a state repository in your community or region? Yes, no, not sure. Take a few minutes to answer that. Everybody done that? Hopefully Erica will be able to show us the results here in a few minutes, just a second. All right, so many of you, about 58% of you, are saying that you do know about your state repository in your community. 3% do not, and 39% do not. So here's some homework for you. Want to check out our website, make sure you know if there's a state approved repository in your neighborhood. If there isn't, and you have a museum or repository in your area that you think should become state approved, let us know. We want to expand this program to those areas. All right. So how else do we get repositories approved? Well, unlike Texas, which actually has their own assessment program, we rely on basically common museum state practices, best practices, some of which were developed in coordination with the American Alliance of Museums, the American Association of State and Local History. They have this continuum of excellence program where there is kind of this progression of assessments, and we have kind of capitalized on that effort as part of trying to help our institutions that want to become state approved to not only know how to best take care of state collections, but also their collections in general. And in addition to showing their reputableness through one of these accreditation programs, we also require that each of our repositories have a collections management policy, as well as an emergency management plan, as well as we have to review their template for collecting or issuing curation agreements, as well as an insurance policy. So hopefully it's something that will be beneficial for all of their collections in general too. Well, there's certainly a number of collections out there that are in need of reanalysis, re-examination, and rehousing. There are a ton of new opportunities out there for researchers, new discoveries that are just kind of waiting. And really, when you think about it, it's probably the most environmental way to do archaeology, and sometimes maybe easier than actually doing an excavation these days. So we want to promote that. We want to make sure that folks are well aware of that. We have a lot of collections that have amazing things in them that just have never really been thoroughly examined or maybe reinterpreted in new ways. So isn't it really kind of the point of collecting these things, right? And science does rely on replication and retesting. Our goal and our aim here is to elevate the status of these collections as to be not just items on the shelf. We want to eliminate this idea that they're kind of this low priority. They're not considered for disaster planning, stabilization, or conservation needs. And I think this is really part of a growing trend within archaeology to share the knowledge that we have as archaeologists and to better integrate that with the larger community and society that we live. So this kind of all falls within that framework. Of course, with a dispersed network, we can avoid some of the situations that centralized repositories have too, and the perceptions that they have. Here's an example from Wyoming. I'm not picking on Wyoming, and Wyoming is actually trying to address this issue, but there's this kind of idea that things kind of fall within this black hole and no one knows exactly how to access them or how to retrieve them. Having these things dispersed within the local community hopefully alleviates that. Plus, it alleviates the risk factor of having a centralized repository. A few years ago, for instance, state of Illinois, for instance, was completely, their centralized repository was shut down. So how do you access the collections in that case? Having things dispersed minimizes or disperses that risk factor as well. Some of the efforts that we also try to do is we have a internship program. So our interns that come through the program are trained enough that they can, and particularly in the Denver area, be able to assist with repository needs. We also offer some trainings. My colleague, Rebecca Simon, is in charge of the program for avocational archaeological certification. She's going to be talking a little bit more about that on the one of the webinars on May 6th, so you might want to check that out. But we do partner with other folks, other institutions and organizations such as the Colorado Archaeological Society and the Western Interior Paleontological Society as well, to help with these archaeological and fossil needs that are out there. So, and we're trying to make this program, grow with it as it's being kind of initiated here. We also offer, at least annually, some training for our repositories. We have our Curation Alliance forums meetings. These are some scenes from November of last year at Colorado State University and at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, who did a great job of showing us some great things. So it's usually a half-day session of training, and then behind the scenes collections tour and exhibitry. And so we're not sure exactly what we're going to be doing for this year because of the pandemic, but we're going to have some sort of training available for folks who are in this program. All right, for local governments, I want to get back to kind of a basics here, and that is about archaeology and how is archaeology recognized in your local community. It's important to remember that you can incorporate archaeological considerations into ordinances and plans if you can be able to have access to more of that kind of effort within your city or your county. Ideally, if you're going to include archaeological resources, you should try to incorporate them in your comprehensive planning documents. But probably the most important way that you're going to be involved in archaeology is going to be as proponents for projects. Those that involve federal or state involvement, you're going to probably have archaeological considerations at your forefront. And those would be like Section 106 projects. I'm going to show you some examples of that in a bit here. But don't forget about museums. And if you're trying to do disaster planning as well, or if you're incorporating that somehow, or you've been asked to from the city or county, don't forget about your repositories. Don't forget about your museums. Those are also valuable parts, and I'll also illustrate that further with one of our examples. So for our second poll question here, our instant poll question this is geared specifically for folks who are involved in local government, but if you know of this as well, does your community have plans that include archaeological resources in their collections? So let me know. Give you a few minutes to fill that out. And hopefully Erica will get the results here. All right, so here's the results. So we have 27% said yes, which is fantastic. 32% said no. All right, well, some work to be done. And 41% not sure. Again, something to consider, particularly how archaeology could be a part of your local community and those collections that may be a result of that. Great, thanks. Okay, so one particular thing that certified local governments can do is, of course, apply for grant funding through our office. And one of the things that you might want to consider or should be aware of, and this is drawn from our HPF manual, grant manual, or Historic Preservation Fund manual, is curation should be considered, particularly when collections are being removed from state, county, or municipal or private property. Negotiations must be made for the permanent collection, curation of these collections. And the other part is access. Archaeological collections and accompanying data and records from grant-assisted work must be available for scholarly research by qualified professionals for use in research, interpretation, preservation, and resource management needs. And if appropriate, collections should be made available to the public through museum display or other means. And while you can't use CLG funding for continual museum operations or permanent exhibits, you can use that costs for temporary exhibits for HPF grant-assisted programs. So those types of things are allowable. So just to keep that in mind, it's a great way to incorporate public outreach and public benefit within your grant program. And this is true not only for CLG grants, but also for SHF grants, as well as grants in general. And so talking more about grants, just some grant tips that I think are valuable. Make sure that if you're going for a grant, make sure that it's aligned to your institution's goals and missions, but also the state priorities, things that are listed on the state plan. Make sure it's sustainable. Make sure that your project is going to live, for this project, but can continue on. So you don't want to do something that's going to be a continual drain on grant funding. Make sure it's manageable. Make sure it's got a real definite start and finish, and make sure that it's really concise. And collaborate with others. And that's really the point of collaborating. Get your institution, your group, working with others. It's going to be better received generally, and it probably will accomplish more in the long run. Partnerships are really essential. So for local governments, museums, boards, it's so much, really so much can be more accomplished if you can outreach to partners. And repositories are going to be much more stronger as well if they can outreach. Consider the museum that is in your community and see if it is state approved, and make sure that you can work together on these different issues. It's so important not only for grant funding, but just for in general. Some partnership factors which I'd like to share with you that I'm kind of borrowing from the Institute of Conservation Leadership is, build trust when you're doing these kinds of partnerships, recognize the benefits, develop good communication skills, and have good defined roles for yourself and other organizations. Understand who's handling the money. It's really an important piece of building a partnership. A good other source for information about this is a book called Magnetic, The Art and Engagement by Anne Bergenson and Beth Tuttle, that's published by the American Alliance of Museum Press. And you can find some blog articles related to this as well. Build core alignment, make sure you embrace 360-degree engagement. In other words, both internally and externally. Empower others, widen your circle to invite outsiders in, become essential, and build trust through high performance. Some really good key tips. If you want to check out more, check out this book. It's valuable to build those relationships. All right, so public outreach is really a big important piece, and we've been talking a little bit more about exhibitry, and I think it is valuable. It's a way that the public can understand a little bit more about the collections that we have. And there are so many opportunities out there, both for permanent exhibits, but really what we're talking mostly about is temporary exhibit. And so one of the best exhibits that's really been touring the state is the one for the Granada relocation camp, or the Japanese internment camp in southeast Colorado, known as, of course, Amachi. This is a traveling exhibit utilizing state collections that have traveled across the state, as well as currently out of state now. This is a great opportunity for the public to greater appreciate the archaeology that has been done at Amache, as well as see some of the artifacts that have been uncovered as a result. So it's a great, great example. And of course, there are countless other examples. Many of our state-approved repositories have small exhibits, either temporary or permanent, that some of which wouldn't probably hurt to have some reanalysis done on them, or redone in some way. And so there's a lot of potential out there, and a lot of opportunity for us to grow and to better outreach to our communities in our local areas. So education is really a key part of this. We need to keep and educate our citizens as to why these collections are important. If we don't do that, these collections will eventually be forgotten or discarded, no matter how well we try to take care of them. The benefits are thus enormous. New research is accomplished, communities can take pride in their own area's history, and ultimately we provide a way for communities to better appreciate their own history and the discipline of archaeology. And Colorado's urban and rural communities can truly embrace and preserve the history we study. It's really a win-win for everyone. So whether that takes the form of small exhibits or lectures or new research or scholarly research, all of that can really be beneficial and help us to really appreciate the artifacts that our repositories are curating for the public. So now I'd like to talk about 3 examples, and we're going to take them one at a time here, about how local communities have become involved with collections. The first one here is from Steamboat Springs, and there was a FEMA project, Federal Emergency Management Agency project up in Steamboat Springs, where they're building a new dam, and it was going to destroy their previously built dam there, and they did some consultations in the local community with Historic Route County as well as the Tread of Pioneers Museum, and they had a real interest in some of the archaeological work that was being conducted as a result of the mitigation efforts from this Section 106 project, related to the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires these consultations as well as the archaeological work. The local community was very interested in making sure that the site was interpreted as a result of the destruction, as well as one of the artifacts, which was this really unique water pipe, wood constructed, dates to about 1906 or so, or 1903, I can't remember the exact dates. But it's really important, and it signifies how important water was to the creation of Steamboat Springs. So it predates Steamboat Springs, but it's really important to the city's history. So because the object was found on city property, it is a state collection, and the state has title to it. So I've been working with the Tread Pioneers Museum to ensure that this collection is properly curated and cared for. They were once approved as a state repository and accepting, and we're getting them reapproved as we speak. So good example of, again, being a project proponent and how archaeology can impact your local community. Another example I'd like to talk about is up in Hinsdale County. This is from last year. The winter of last year, we had a lot of snowfall in the San Juans, and this caused a real danger because there was a lot of avalanche activity that caused a lot of down timber, particularly in Hinsdale Creek. And because there was so much down timber, the fear was that all of this down timber was going to get into the creek and then pose a danger in bringing down a couple of dams in the area. And the modeling projections showed that if that were to occur, there could be a huge burst on the dams, which would impact all of Lake City. Lake City could have been inundated. And as a result of that, the Federal Emergency Management Program and others from the state, as well as folks from our CHR task force, which is a voluntary group that I'm a part of, that helps to make sure that collections and things like museums are better protected for disaster purposes, that the Hinsdale County Museum, the recommendation was to remove all the artifacts out of harm's way while the danger was present. So that actually did occur, and with some help from the State Historical Fund and other sources, they were able to put a berm around the museum and also do some mitigation to help the museum in the event that this catastrophe, potentially this threat could happen again. It's a really good example of how a local community, though, had really gotten together and was really concerned about its repository, its museum, and of course all the historic buildings as well. So good example. Don't forget about these repositories, particularly when you're doing disaster planning. I think that it's really important. We're going to probably be seeing more and more disasters, unfortunately. And so it's important for our communities to consider them. My third example here is from the city of Colorado Springs and the Camp Creek Drainage Project. This is also another FEMA project where they were going to do some flood mitigation and create a detention pond in the north area of Garden of the Gods, which is owned by the city of Colorado Springs. And we're really fortunate that the city of Colorado Springs has its own city archaeologist, Anna Cordova, who did some ground truthing of the area, did some survey work, and really recognized that she was uncovering a lot of very unique artifacts and of quite interesting, and showed some status, if you will. So she soon realized that this dump area, if you will, this trash area was in fact related to the Glen Eyrie estate, which is just north of there. And so this is the home, of course, of General William Palme. And he, of course, is a very important person in the city of Colorado Springs. He was the founder of Colorado Springs, and also a really important person in our state's history. And so Matt Mayberry, who is the Director of Cultural Resources, really did capitalize on the work, and through the assistance of Alpine Archaeology, who did a lot of the excavations and mitigation for the work. They were able to really collect a lot of material, and it gave us a really unique understanding of General William Palme and his life. And it really kind of led to a reanalysis of some of the misconceptions or thoughts that might have occurred with his family. There was a lot of high quality esteemed goods that were coming into his estate all the way from Bulgaria. He was able to afford that, of course. There was a lot of alcohol containers, so we're not sure if that was he himself consuming a lot of alcohol or his servants, but it sort of makes us question, you know, he was a well-known Quaker. A lot of people didn't think he was someone who consumed alcohol, but maybe he did, or maybe others did in his household. So this was all great interest, obviously, to the city of Colorado Springs, and they really, really capitalized on it. So much so that they kind of instantaneously set up an exhibit to kind of also capitalize on the sesquicentennial celebration for Colorado Springs. And so they were able to bring some of those artifacts into the Pioneer Museum and display them with some of the other archival material that they already had on William Palmer. And really, I think this is a great example of how a local community has really capitalized on the artifacts and made them more publicly available in an instant way. So how else do we do with things here at History Colorado and the Office of the State Archaeologist and Office of Archaeology, or Office of Historic Preservation, Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation? We also take a lot of the data that the inventories that come from permitting processes, and we try to make sure that they're linked to our database. So this helps researchers understand where our collections are housed, and also gives, you know, us a better understanding of where the collections are. So that's part of what we do. We also have a lot of helpful tools on our website, a lot of guides for our repository partners to follow. We also have a newsletter. If any of you are interested and would like to receive that and you're not, just send me an email and I'll make sure you get on that list. And I will just take a look. This is our state approved repository program website. So I'm going to take you there now just to kind of show you real briefly what we have on that website. We have information that's in different sections. We have some of the allowed practices and allowances, as well as the rules and procedures, application to become a repository, some guidebooks, some guidance on doing loans. We have a kind of a library of information, response, some templates for our repositories to follow. We also have information for students and volunteers. We have a list of sites that may be of interest for developing a capstone project or a thesis that have collections involved with them. We have our list of museums. We also have a map of all of our institutions, which you can expand and make bigger so you know what repositories are in your area. We also have a list of repositories that sites that have collections that we have an understanding of where those collections are housed, so you know. I have to say that there's a little caveat with this list. It is a work in progress, so there are some omissions and there are some things that we know that are probably maybe perhaps not completely accurate. So this is a list that gets us to some understanding of where the collections are, but we're still working on that. But again, it helps with our researchers trying to figure out, gosh, I'm interested in this site. Where do I go? To what institution do I go to find that collection? So that's part of it as well. All right, so you will want to check out that website when you have time, and it has a lot of other information that's listed there. So indeed, I say it does belong in a museum. And particularly, unlike the Hollywood movies, it really does require, you know, partnerships. It requires outreach. It requires all of us to kind of get a better understanding of what these collections are and letting other folks know about them, and particularly our archaeological community. So if you have other questions too, you can always reach me. There's my website, or sorry, my email and my phone number. Feel free if you have any questions about the program in general going forward. And I'm gonna now try to address some of the Q&A questions that folks had. So let me get back to that. And let me look back at the chat functions. Looks like there were a lot of folks who got onto that. So hopefully, Erica, thanks for answering some of the questions that were posed in that forum. But let me go to some of the Q&A questions here. And the first one is from Cindy, who says, so who does the museum charge for curation fees? Great question. The answer to that question is the fees are charged to the permittees. So those that receive a permit, those organizations are going to be the ones who are going to be charged the curation fee for. So if they're doing work, as the examples that I showed you, those FEMA projects and so forth, the collections that are going to then be put into our approved repository, those are going to be charged to that organization. In that case, it would have been Alpine Archaeology. Ultimately, that would have probably been paid for by FEMA, for instance. I hope that answers your question, Cindy. All right, and then Tamara says, where can a small local museum find resources on how collections and artifacts need to be handled from accessioning, cataloging, storing, and display? We have a few of those resources up on our website, so I encourage you to take a look at that. There are also a lot of guidance that's available through our partner organizations. So first among those, of course, would be the American Alliance of Museums, but we also have a lot of really great local resources, and I'd like to say the Colorado Wyoming Association of Museums is a great place to find a lot of that information. They're also a great organization to partner with as well with these things. So that would be another source. And if you need more further assistance, feel free to email me and maybe I can get you a list of other resources in the area that I can get you that information. So hopefully that answers your question, Tamara. Cindy, thank you so much. Thank you. There's a few more minutes here, so if anybody else has questions, I'm going to go look back through the chats here. Looks like things were answered so much. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and it's a really it's a great program. I think it has so much potential to even expand beyond what it currently is, and it's great to partner with so many great folks that work in museums and historic preservation. So great, we're actually done early, I guess. So I'll hang out here if there's more questions.